There is a man right now circling the North American continent on a private jet. He lands, watches 90 minutes of football, boards the plane again, and flies to a different city, sometimes crossing an international border to catch a second match before midnight. Then he does it again the next morning, and the morning after that. His name is Gianni Infantino. He runs FIFA. And while he burns through jet fuel at a rate that would make a climate scientist physically ill, the organization he controls is simultaneously standing at podiums across the world, making solemn promises about carbon neutrality, electric vehicles, and saving the planet. The gap between those two realities is not irony, it is policy. And it is the defining story of a tournament that scientists are now officially calling the most polluting sporting event in the entire recorded history of organized competition. But before we get to the 9 million tons, we need to talk about the political circus surrounding this man. Because the carbon scandal does not exist in a vacuum. It sits inside a larger pattern of behavior that tells you something very specific about how FIFA operates when nobody is holding it accountable. Infantino has been a regular presence at the White House since Trump's return to the presidency in January 2025. Close enough that the human rights organization Fair Square filed a formal ethics complaint against him with FIFA's own ethics committee, accusing him of repeatedly violating FIFA's statutory obligation of political neutrality. The complaint specifically called out Infantino for presenting Donald Trump with the so-called FIFA Peace Prize, an award that does not appear to have any meaningful selection criteria ahead of the tournament. The Norwegian Football Federation, one of the more principled national associations in European football, publicly endorsed the complaint. NFF President Lisa Klaveness called on FIFA to scrap the Peace Prize altogether to preserve the organization's credibility. FIFA, predictably, has not responded in any substantive way. Meanwhile, Infantino keeps turning up at the White House, keeps appearing alongside Trump at public events, and keeps steering the organization that is supposed to stand above politics deeper into the orbit of one of the most divisive political figures on Earth. What does any of this have to do with carbon emissions? Everything, because it tells you exactly who this organization answers to, and it is not the climate scientists, the players, or the fans paying four-figure ticket prices to watch matches in dangerous heat. Then there is the Iran situation, which is the kind of thing that would have been unimaginable at any previous World Cup. For the first time in tournament history, one of the host nations is actively engaged in military conflict with one of the competing countries, the United States and Iran, sharing a tournament. Infantino confirmed Iran's participation at the FIFA Congress in Vancouver in May, framing it as football triumphing over politics. But Iranian officials told a very different story on the ground. The team faced strict travel restrictions inside the United States. Visa complications reportedly disrupted multiple members of the Iranian delegation. FIFA declined requests to relocate Iran's matches away from American soil, and a Somali referee named Artan, who had been set to become the first Somali official ever to work a World Cup, was reportedly denied entry into the United States entirely. These are not administrative hiccups. These are the direct consequences of Infantino's decision to hold the tournament in a country whose current government has active sanctions and travel restrictions against one of the participating nations, while simultaneously cultivating a relationship with that government's leader so close that a human rights NGO filed a formal ethics complaint about it. And all of that backstory matters because it is the same Infantino who is now touring this same continent in a private jet, attending 2 matches per day, while his organization tells the world it cares about sustainability. In the first 10 days of the 2026 World Cup, Infantino appeared in the stands at 14 matches across 11 different stadiums: Mexico City, Guadalajara, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Vancouver, Seattle, Kansas City, Houston. He attended the tournament opener in Mexico City, then immediately flew to Guadalajara for a second game that same evening. Next day, Los Angeles. Day after that, San Francisco and Vancouver. 2 cities, 2 flights, 1 day. FIFA sources confirmed he plans to maintain this pace, 2 matches per day whenever possible, through the round of 16 and into the knockout stages. The aircraft making all of this possible is a private jet provided to him by Qatar Airways, one of FIFA's official commercial partners. The investigative outlet Jazmar reported that Infantino used that jet to accumulate approximately 600,000 kilometers in just 3 years up to September 2024. 600,000 kilometers. That is the distance to the moon and then most of the way back for one man's schedule. A French carbon analysis firm called Greenley ran the emissions calculation on what that private travel actually costs the atmosphere. Their number should land like a verdict. 1 single hour aboard that aircraft produces roughly the same volume of carbon dioxide as an average human being generates over an entire year. Not a day, a year. 1 hour of flying equals 12 months of living. And if Infantino continues his 2 cities-a-day pattern through the knockout rounds and attends the final 8 matches of the tournament, Greenley projects his jet alone will generate somewhere between 300 and 500 tons of carbon dioxide over the course of the competition. That is the equivalent annual carbon output of between 35 and 55 people. 1 man, 1 plane, 1 summer. The yearly emissions of roughly 50 human beings gone into the atmosphere so the FIFA president can log his attendance record. John Hossavar of Greenpeace USA did not mince his language. Having executives take daily flights on highly polluting private jets, he said, does not exactly send the message that FIFA recognizes the cause of climate change or its responsibility to be part of the solution. That is the diplomatic version of what climate researchers are actually saying in private. But here is the part FIFA is most desperate for you not to focus on. Infantino's jet is embarrassing. It is not, however, the actual scandal. It is the visible tip of a structure that FIFA deliberately designed from the ground up, a tournament architecture that makes catastrophic carbon emissions not a side effect, but a mathematical certainty. This is the first World Cup ever staged across 3 countries simultaneously. FIFA expanded the field from 32 teams to 48, which pushed the total match count from 64 all the way up to 104 games. They then distributed those games across 16 stadiums, spread up to 2,800 miles apart, stretching across 4 time zones from Vancouver in the north to Miami in the south. When you spread a competition across distances that vast, flying is not a choice for anyone involved. It is the only option. Teams, fans, officials, broadcast crews, journalists, everyone flies, over and over again. For weeks, a geographer at the University of Lausanne named David Gogishvili gave this structural problem its most precise label, FIFA's sustainability paradox. FIFA brags relentlessly that it did not build new stadiums for this tournament, unlike Qatar in 2022. And that is technically accurate. But Gogishvili identified exactly what they did instead. They eliminated the carbon cost of construction, and then they created a vastly larger carbon cost through unavoidable intercontinental air travel. They did not solve the problem. They relocated it to a different column on the spreadsheet, and in doing so, made it significantly worse. And worse still, this model transfers the actual cost, financial and environmental, onto the fans and host communities. FIFA designs the geography. You pay for the flights with your money, and the atmosphere pays for them with its stability. The total emissions figure that results from all of this is a number that deserves to be stated slowly. A 2025 report produced by Scientists for Global Responsibility in collaboration with the Environmental Defense Fund and the Cool Down Initiative estimated the full carbon footprint of the 2026 World Cup at approximately 9 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. 9 million. That is nearly double the average of the previous 4 World Cups. It is larger than the total annual emissions of multiple entire countries. Researchers described it as equivalent to more than 6 million cars being driven in the United Kingdom for a full year, or the entire annual carbon output of a country like Sierra Leone. The aviation component alone accounts for 7.7 million tons, more than 4 times the average of World Cups held between 2010 and 2022. Worst-case projections, depending on modeling assumptions, reach as high as 13.7 million tons. A single match at this tournament is estimated to produce between 44,000 and 72,000 tons of carbon dioxide. There are 104 matches. For context, the Qatar 2022 World Cup, the tournament that received the most sustained climate criticism in the history of the competition, the one where they built 7 new stadiums, flew in grass on climate-controlled aircraft, and ran air-conditioned outdoor fan zones in the desert, Weerstifarst, Echtiziksbais, produced somewhere between 3.6 and 3.8 million tons. The 2026 tournament more than doubles that figure. Qatar, which was supposed to be the cautionary tale, now looks almost modest by comparison. The New Weather Institute, a UK climate think tank, stated flatly that this is the most polluting sporting event ever staged, not the most polluting World Cup, not the most polluting sporting event this decade, ever. Now, put a human face on it, because this is where it stops being an abstraction. The BBC calculated what following your team actually costs in carbon. An England supporter, flying from London and attending every match through to the final, racks up nearly 15,000 miles of travel and generates approximately 3.5 tons of carbon dioxide, the same as heating an average British home for 19 straight months. Just to watch football, and England fans are actually among the geographically closer fan bases. Supporters from South Africa following their team deep into the tournament could face over 26,000 miles of travel and nearly 6 tons of carbon emissions per person, exceeding the average South African's total carbon output for an entire year. A researcher from Scientists for Global Responsibility called these figures deeply disturbing, noting that 3.4 tons is 2 to 3 times the entire annual carbon footprint of an average person living in a lower-income country like Haiti. The teams themselves are not spared. Bosnia and Herzegovina logged over 3,000 miles of travel just in the group stage, moving between Toronto, Los Angeles, and Seattle, while basing themselves in Salt Lake City between fixtures. That is not football logistics. That is a continental airline schedule with a kickoff at the end of each leg. And then comes the part of the story that is either darkly comic or simply cruel, depending on your tolerance for institutional irony. The same tournament that is pumping millions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere is also being battered by the climate change that carbon is actively accelerating. Heat at the 2026 World Cup is not a background concern. It is a documented health crisis. Climate research group World Weather Attribution found that roughly a quarter of all 104 matches could be played in conditions exceeding the safety limits recommended by FIFPro, the Global Players Union. That is almost twice the heat risk seen at the 1994 World Cup, held on the same continent. 14 of the 16 host stadiums could breach the critical threshold of 28 degrees Celsius wet bulb globe temperature, the point at which FIFPro says matches should be postponed entirely. Before the tournament started, more than 20 global experts in health and climate science sent an open letter directly to FIFA, warning that current heat safety protocols were inadequate and outdated compared to the scientific evidence. Around 5 matches are expected to take place in conditions where player postponement would be the professionally recommended response. The UN Climate Change Executive Secretary Simon Steele said publicly that the risk of dangerous heat has doubled since 1994 and that players and fans are now genuinely in danger. FIFA responded by saying its protocols are robust. Players kept playing in conditions that coaches described, off the record, as genuinely frightening. Heat already kills more Americans every single year than any other extreme weather event. More than hurricanes, more than tornadoes, more than floods. FIFA built the most carbon-intensive World Cup in history in a climate zone being actively destabilized by carbon emissions, and then watched its own athletes gasp for air in the heat those emissions helped produce. They poured accelerant on a fire, and then protested that the temperature inside the stadium was uncomfortable. That is the context in which FIFA's sustainability pledges need to be read. And reading them in that context, the word greenwashing shifts from being an activist accusation to being a factually accurate description. At the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow, Infantino walked to the podium and personally presented FIFA's climate roadmap: halve emissions by 2030, reach net zero by 2040. He claimed the Qatar 2022 World Cup would be carbon neutral. Here is precisely what happened to that claim. Carbon Market Watch formally accused FIFA of greenwashing. Swiss advertising regulators investigated and then ordered FIFA to stop making the carbon neutral claim. The Swiss Commission's finding was unambiguous. FIFA had made false and misleading statements about the environmental impact of the Qatar tournament. It was, in effect, an official red card from a regulator for false advertising. FIFA has not used the phrase carbon neutral in connection with the 2026 World Cup. That silence is itself revealing. For all the stage rhetoric about halving emissions by 2030, FIFA has not set a single binding, measurable carbon target for this specific tournament. Gogishvili puts the comparison bluntly. The International Olympic Committee is actually following its reduction targets and demonstrably moving in the right direction. FIFA, he says, simply does not prioritize reducing its environmental impact. The pledges exist to manage public relations. The spreadsheet where the actual targets would live remains empty. Then look at who is financing this operation. In April 2024, FIFA signed a 4-year global partnership with Saudi Aramco, Saudi Arabia's state-owned oil company. Aramco is the single largest corporate greenhouse gas emitter on the entire planet. Its operations alone are responsible for over 4% of all global emissions since 1965. It has emitted more greenhouse gases than any other organization since the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. The deal covers both the 2026 Men's World Cup and the 2027 Women's World Cup. The backlash was immediate and unusually forceful. More than 100 professional female footballers signed a public letter to Infantino, calling it a middle finger to women's soccer. Canadian international Jessie Fleming wrote that in taking Aramco's sponsorship, FIFA is choosing money over women's safety and the safety of the planet. Amnesty International's head of economic and social justice warned that income from Aramco should not be used to finance or gloss over human rights abuses through sports washing. Fair Square, the same NGO that filed the ethics complaint against Infantino over his Trump relationship, called the Aramco deal a direct extension of the broader sports washing strategy Saudi Arabia is executing across global sport simultaneously. Formula One, Eliv Golf, heavyweight boxing, the Saudi Football League with its imported international stars, and now 2 consecutive FIFA World Cups, 2034 in Saudi Arabia, with 11 stadiums that do not yet exist, being built in desert heat with a workforce whose rights groups have documented in detail. Frank Heising from the campaign group Fossil Free Football said that by permitting Aramco to associate its brand with the World Cup, FIFA is enabling the normalization of fossil fuels at the precise moment the world most urgently needs to move away from them. Activists stage protests outside World Cup venues during the first week of the tournament, specifically targeting the Aramco partnership. On June 22nd, The Guardian reported directly on the growing pressure campaign, with protesters demanding FIFA terminate the deal immediately. FIFA's official response was that revenues from commercial partnerships are reinvested back into football development at all levels. The private jet Infantino tours the continent on, meanwhile, belongs to Qatar Airways, another FIFA commercial partner. When you account for the full downstream impact of fossil fuel sponsorship, alongside direct tournament emissions, the Play the Game Research Institute suggested the total footprint of the 2026 World Cup could reach 70 million tons of carbon dioxide. 70 million. If accurate, that would represent one of the largest climate costs ever attached to any single organized event in modern history. There is also an entire dimension of this footprint that never appears in any official FIFA sustainability document. Sports ecologist and author Mai-Lise Rue has described it as the part of the carbon footprint nobody discusses, but that is massive: the digital footprint. Broadcasting infrastructure, streaming platforms, data feeds, sports betting applications. All of it operates on data centers, satellite uplinks, and the billions of devices fans use to follow the tournament simultaneously. In an era when the default viewing experience involves a television and a phone running simultaneously, the energy consumption behind a major match is substantial. The United Kingdom's national grid operator estimated that each of England's and Scotland's group stage matches could push national electricity demand up by 600 megawatts, the equivalent of the combined electricity consumption of Glasgow and Leeds for a single 90-minute game. Multiply that across every major football market watching a knockout match simultaneously, and the scale becomes genuinely staggering. None of that appears in FIFA's carbon accounting. It is invisible because it is inconvenient. Rue argues that when you include the full scope, the true cost is substantially higher than the headline 9 million tons. The headline figure is already historically unprecedented. The real figure is worse. One climate researcher cut through all of it with a single observation that is worth sitting with. The emissions from a World Cup are, by definition, luxury emissions, not survival emissions. Nobody is heating their home with these flights. Nobody is feeding their family because a private jet crossed from Mexico City to Guadalajara. These are, in the researchers' words, ultra-wealthy decision-makers and their networks burning fossil fuels at scale for the purpose of watching a sporting event. Calling that behavior, in the middle of an accelerating, documented climate emergency, particularly obscene and discouraging is not hyperbole. It is a clinical description. What makes it genuinely maddening rather than merely depressing is that alternatives exist, are documented, and have already been proven to work. A UK football consultancy survey found that 72% of Generation Z football fans care about environmental issues, and 61% specifically want football organizations to become more environmentally responsible. The demand for change is not fringe activism. It is the majority position among the sport's youngest audience, and the practical blueprint for how to do it differently already exists in recent tournament history. The 2024 European Championship in Germany gave every ticket holder access to a flat-rate train ticket across the entire national rail network for the price of $29, covering travel to and from matches. Local public transport was free for 36 hours around every game. It was a massive, commercially successful international tournament that actively directed fans toward trains and away from aircraft. The atmosphere was celebrated. Attendance was strong. Carbon costs were a fraction of what a comparable multi-country format would have produced. FIFA watched it happen. FIFA knows exactly how it works. The decision not to apply anything similar to the 2026 tournament was not an oversight. It was a choice. FIFA also had a direct alternative placed in front of it. When awarding the Women's World Cup, they received a joint bid from Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, in which every single match venue would have been reachable by train, with no intercontinental flying required from any fan anywhere in Europe. It was, structurally, the kind of low-carbon tournament format that FIFA's own sustainability pledges demand. FIFA turned it down. The commercial logic of a more geographically scattered format, more broadcast markets, more sponsorship inventory, more political goodwill from more governments, won the internal calculation without, apparently, any meaningful consideration of what the planet pays for it. The 2030 World Cup will be split across Morocco, Portugal, and Spain, with 3 additional centenary matches staged in Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. The intercontinental flight distances built into that structure make 2026 look restrained by comparison. The 2034 tournament goes to Saudi Arabia, 11 stadiums, none of which currently exist, being built from scratch in extreme desert heat, in a country whose record on migrant construction worker rights has been documented by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and dozens of investigative journalists. After years of criticism over Qatar's construction death toll, official figures counted dozens, while investigative reporting by The Guardian and others estimated the number of migrant worker deaths in the broader construction sector. During World Cup preparations at over 6,000 FIFA awarded structurally identical conditions to a larger, hotter country. The pattern is not accidental. It is the business model. Every expansion decision FIFA has made, 48 teams instead of 32, 16 stadiums instead of 8, 3 host countries instead of 1, fossil fuel partners instead of clean energy brands, desert hosts instead of compact European train networks, follows the same internal logic. More markets, more inventory, more political allies, more revenue. The carbon bill goes to the atmosphere. The reputational cost gets managed with sustainability reports and net zero pledges and banners in stadium concourses. And the private jet keeps flying. What FIFA has built with the 2026 World Cup is not a failure of coordination or a miscalculation of consequence. It is a fully coherent system that produces exactly the outcomes its incentive structure demands. 9 million tons of carbon, or 70 million when you count the full scope of fossil fuel money running through the tournament. 85 to 90% of direct emissions from flights that the geographic design made structurally unavoidable. A president who personally generates the annual carbon output of 50 people on a jet, provided by a sponsor airline. Matches played in dangerous heat in cities whose temperatures are being pushed higher by the same emissions the tournament produces. And a formal regulatory finding from a Swiss advertising body that FIFA made false and misleading statements when it last claimed environmental responsibility. The sustainability report is not a roadmap. It is a press release. The net zero pledge is not a policy. It is a slogan on a banner at the entrance to a stadium that someone flew a private jet to reach. And the contrail cutting across the sky above the World Cup tells you with perfect clarity exactly how much any of it means to the organization that drew this map and chose to build a tournament inside it.